The Knowledge Media Podcast with Heather Prozac.
Leighton Grey joins us on Knowledge Media Podcast. Leighton Grey is a senior partner, a litigator, and I think it's safe to say someone involved in a court case that's very interesting to a lot of us. Tell us a little bit more about yourself so that people kind of get a gauge for who you are.
Well, I was born in Saskatchewan. My father's family is originally from a place called Sintaluda, Saskatchewan, and so on my father's side, we come from the Carry the Kettle First Nation, or the Jack Band. And I was born in Regina, although I don't remember Regina because my parents were part of the first wave of expats who came from Saskatchewan to Edmonton and to Alberta in the oil boom. And so I grew up in Edmonton and went to school there. I lived in Edmonton back in those days, and Calgary is probably the same way, was a sort of a collection of what were called community leagues. And so whatever community league you were part of, that was like your small town. And so I grew up in a wonderful community called Kensington in the northwest part of Edmonton, sort of close to St. Albert, but not in the same socioeconomic stratosphere as St. Albert's sort of one of the poshier parts of Edmonton. I went to school there, played a lot of sports as a kid, grew up in a religious household. My mother was very involved in the Lutheran Church. I went to school on Saturdays. We went to German school. And
wow.
so German school was actually going to school. We went to Sunday school too, but we got the bonus day where on Saturdays we went to German school. And what we did is we learned the Lutheran Catholic German. So I basically went to school 7 days a week, which at the time really was not great. But in hindsight, I'm very grateful for it because, of course, I was raised in the light of an awareness of God and the Christian church, and I'm still a person of faith today. And also, I learned, I was raised with the language of German, which was a big part of my mother's background. My first degree was in English literature. I did an honors thesis in Shakespeare, if you can believe it. And during that time, I was playing junior hockey, and I actually played college hockey at Camrose before that. And I went to law school. I was only 20 when I got accepted into law school at the University of Alberta.
What made you get into law school, Leighton? What was the pull?
I knew that I wanted to get into some form of graduate studies, and I had, I was a person who studied hard and had very good grades, and I had earned some scholarships. There was one scholarship. It was called the Louise McKinney at that time for students who I think were in the top. This sounds like I'm boasting, but I'm just giving you an idea. I was in the top 1% of the grade point average at the University of Alberta, actually in the province of Alberta. And so I'd figured out that I had an affinity for learning, and I was a bit of a geek. Like I'm even to this day, I'm a person who will consume 2 to 3 books a week, whether reading or listening to books or whatever, and all kinds of things. And I was offered the opportunity to take graduate studies in either English or history, but I spent some time around the professors, and I realized that I was not cut out for academic life. I just was not my crowd,
I don't know why you would say that at all.
Yeah, because I was sort of I was a jock geek. I was a contradiction. Most people will look at me, would not think that I was an intellectual, and I'm probably not. But
no,
but
you are. I've met you a few times now.
I look like an old hockey player, basically. I've had over 200 stitches in my face and had all my teeth knocked out and probably been concussed several times. So I realized that wasn't the route for me, and so I turned to law school, and I thought about becoming a lawyer early on. The problem was cost. There was a real daunting expense to it. Fortunately, I was very fortunate. I applied for and I received a scholarship that was given out to only 10 students in the whole country. And so I was able to go to law school. I'm very grateful for that, because if that weren't there, I probably wouldn't be a lawyer today. But what law school does do, it exposes you to a certain system of logic, of way of thinking, of way of solving problems, even from the way that you read signs. I took articles with the Federal Department of Justice in Edmonton, which is basically the biggest law firm in Canada. That was a great experience because I got exposed to um, many different types of cases, and also I was able to work on some very high profile cases that were going to the Supreme Court of Canada, for example, and there were a lot of great lawyers there at that time. But it also again revealed to me that I was not cut out for government life, and so I left that job, and I went down to Florida for a year to play semi-professional hockey in Daytona Beach, Florida.
Your family's
And
thinking you're never going to practice law again. You're going to
very,
be
oh
on
yeah,
the beach. That's
oh
it.
yeah. My mother was horrified. What's wrong, Leighton? Why are you quitting on your life? It's all in front of you. I was only 25, 26. And but then what happened was the team was sold, and they offered me I was offered a chance to go play in Biloxi, Mississippi, and I said I think I'll go home and take up this law thing again. And so I did. And when I took it up again, I took it up very, very seriously. And I actually moved to I took a job in St. Paul with a wonderful lawyer named Vital Willett, who subsequently became a judge. And that was I was very fortunate to be trained by somebody who was a very good lawyer, highly ethical, but he was also very generous with his time and his knowledge. And I
Mm.
wish that every young lawyer would have that experience, because I didn't realize it at the time, but it is quite rare. It's exceptional to have that. And then within a few years after he became a judge, I started my own firm. Um, the big change in my life happened, if you want me to go into it, was
I'd
in
love it if you want
okay.
to. I didn't know if we should or not, and I was
Yeah.
like, because we have you are if no one knows your name, they really should know your name. But you have handled some massive cases, but
Oh
not
yeah.
only that, you have your own story to tell. So let's go into that. I think what was
Yeah.
it, 2020?
Yeah. So what happened was around 2020, right after Jason Kenney swept into office, what had happened was while Rachel Notley was premier, she had populated a lot of the boards, administrative boards in Alberta, with people who were uh, basically, well, I'll just say it, they were socialists. They were
Mhm.
very deep into the NDP thinking. And one of the things that Jason Kenney did when he came to power was to depopulate these these boards. And so I got a call from a prominent conservative lawyer in Calgary. I won't say his name, but he said, I've heard about you. I've heard that you're a very strong conservative, and would you serve on a board to select judges? I said, I will do it as long as I get to I get to select people according to my conscience. He said, yeah, don't worry about that. That's why we want you. So I was appointed, and then in that time period, this is going back to let's say the early part of the first or second wave of the pandemic, May of 2020. Of course, the NDP, Rachel Notley, they were very upset about the depopulation of these boards. And of course, they started looking me up on social media. I didn't have much of a social media presence at the time. I was only on a platform called LinkedIn, but I had been very outspoken in some of my comments on LinkedIn on certain topics, just expressing conservative views. I was critical of Black Lives Matter.
Mhm.
I call Black Lives Matter what it is. It's a socialist terrorist
Mhm.
organization. And of course, now 2 years on, everybody this is obvious. But at the time, I was like, oh, how can you
Yes.
criticize them? My name was bounced around like a football in the legislature for a couple of weeks. I was the I was the toy at the time,
Did you know this
and
was happening? Like, did you know there was this conversation going on
mm.
after you'd posted? Did you hear murmurings?
I did. I started to. It came through actually a criminal defense lawyers organization, which I didn't realize at the time. I was a member of it. I didn't realize that it was very loyal to Rachel Notley and the NDP, and they basically outed me, as it were. I had made a pledge on LinkedIn that basically was that I was going to select um, people based upon merit with no regard for their intersectional characteristics. Because my thought about this is that when you're selecting a judge and you're going to give that person so much power, so much ability to impact and shape people's lives, we must have the very best, most competent people. And so basically, what I said was, okay, if we're going to select 6 judges, and the 6 most competent people are women, I'm picking 6 women.
Isn't
Or
that
if
common
they're,
sense? Isn't that something that you're like, wow,
yeah,
that's a rational statement to
yeah.
make?
It was
Yeah.
the day before yesterday. And it should not have been controversial. There's a wonderful book. It was written by a British author named Douglas Murray, who happens to be gay. Uh, but he wrote a wonderful book called The Madness of Crowds. It came out about 2 years ago. And he talked about intersectionality. So he looked at the feminist movement, he looked at the transgender movement, he looked at the critical race theory people, and he compared all of them as movements. And he has this wonderful metaphor in the book where he describes all of these people, all the downtrodden people of the world, all the sort of victim culture people, and they're on a train, and the train is coming into a station, and the sign above the station says equality. And all the rest of the people, the so-called majority, are standing on the platform, and we're waiting for all the people to disembark and get off the train, and we can live in this utopian universe where everybody's equal and there's perfect equity. So what happens is the train is coming into the station, and just when you think it's going to slow down and all these people are going to get off and we're all going to be equal, suddenly the train speeds up, careens through the station, and then crashes. Okay. And the metaphor is this, that this concept, this intersectionality, diversity, I call it DIE, diversity, inclusion, equity, is a cult. It's a hateful ideology because it pits people against each other, and it
Mhm.
really isn't about equality. It's about power. And so the people who
Wow.
are claiming victimhood, first of all, they're constantly fighting with each other, and they want to be dominant. They want to be dominant in the culture. See, so it's not about equality. It's about putting intersectionality, putting your differences above other people. It's about power.
When you're at, I don't want to see the peak of your career because I think that's discounting everything that you've done in your career, but you're kind of
It's
on
all
this.
downhill from here.
Depends who you ask.
I wouldn't wish this experience on anyone. Actually, it really is. It's really not enjoyable. But in the end, what happened was I was, the CBC ran a piece on me. They called me a racist, a misogynist, so on and so forth. All absolute rubbish. The prime minister's private hitman who writes hit pieces. He's a guy at the University of Toronto. Called me what did he call me? A latent anti-Semite, whatever that means. And so went through this whole experience, and then it culminated in the government of Alberta asking me to, they thought that I should resign. And the advice that I got was bad advice in hindsight from the government. The minister at the time said, "Look, we're going to have to make a change. So if you don't resign, we're going to have to remove you. Why don't you resign? Because then there'll be less of a backlash." Well, the opposite was true, because when I did resign, I tried to be a good team player for the Conservatives, and but that was taken publicly as an admission of wrongdoing, that I was all these things. And of course, that only conflagrated things, and it exposed me to further public vilification.
So
Mhm.
what's going through you at the time?
Well, first of all, you feel very vulnerable,
Yeah.
very exposed. It's like a leaf blowing in the wind. And what I thought about was actually all the people who relied on me, and I felt to some degree that I had let them down. Because I have a whole staff of people working in my office. Of course, many hundreds of clients, the other lawyers in my office, colleagues, and this hit pretty close to home. For example, I was on a prestigious board with the Law Society where I sat as basically as a judge in disciplinary proceedings involving lawyers, and they summarily, kicked me off that board. And I was part of an organization called the Alberta Civil Trial Lawyers Association that had just given me a lifetime achievement award, a humanitarian award for service to Indigenous people, and they asked for the award back. This is what it's like when you're in this crucible and you're just getting squeezed. And so in that moment, a wonderful thing happened, and that was some people reached out to me, people that I didn't know were there. And of course, until you go through something like this, and you know what I'm talking about, Heather, until you go through this, you don't realize these people are there and they're watching, and they're just waiting to see you cross over, as it were, and then they reach out to you. So for example, John Carpe of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms reached out to me, and he offered support.
Wow.
And Ezra Levant and Sheila Gunn-Reid of Rebel News, they reached out. In
Wow.
fact, they ran some pieces that you can find on the internet. They interviewed me where I could sort of, try and clear the record, set the record straight, as it were.
Because no one was trying to help you. You were,
No,
when you look at who
yeah,
was covering the story,
yeah,
there's only certain places you can go, and it was negative
yeah.
stuff.
And those stories you can't, once they're there, that's the terrible thing about the internet is once that stuff is there, it's there forever, and you can't take it back. So when people go and Google me, they're going to find these awful stories about me in the top. So I guess that's part of the reason why I just keep going. I'm trying to just kill all of these bad stories,
When
right?
someone
I
Googles, you
just
want
keep
the other
going.
ones to rise above.
Yeah, I just keep producing. One of the great things that happened was John Carpe offered to have me do contract work for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and I had never done hardcore constitutional law. I'd done a lot of civil litigation, spent a lot of time suing the government and big companies, and I'd done all manner of criminal cases. I'd done murder trials in front of juries and things like that, and so I had a lot of experience as a litigator, and so they wanted somebody who had that kind of experience to help them at the Justice Center. And I was known for, and I am known for, my, I guess I will call it expertise in cross-examination, because I'm a courtroom lawyer, and I'd made a close study over many, many years of techniques in cross-examination. And so part of the job that they hired me to do was to take on this case involving the Alberta government, and where the main event, as it were, was going to be to cross-examine Dr. Deena Hinshaw. And so that was the beginning of that. That happened about a year and a half ago.
Hmm.
And so I've been working on that case for quite some time, and then learning more and more about constitutional law, so that now actually I'm almost entirely immersed in constitutional law, constitutional cases. Charter of Rights and Freedoms was added to our Constitution. And what it basically says is that if the federal government or the provincial government or municipal governments, if they pass laws that are inconsistent, which violate these protected rights, for example, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, all the things basically that were swept aside during lockdowns, that those laws are unconstitutional, and therefore they can be struck down. They can be erased,
Mhm.
vitiated under the law. And this has happened many, many times over the history of the Charter over the past 40 years. But it's not happening recently. Courts in Canada have been consistently saying that even though these restrictions, non-pharmaceutical interventions, they're called, even though these violate clearly charter rights, they can be saved under Section 1 of the Charter, which is a saving provision that basically says that it's okay if the government violates rights as long as that violation can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. In other words, if the public good outweighs the individual harm, then that can be upheld. And unfortunately, that's what's been happening in our courts. So when we turn to the Ingram case in Alberta, the one where Dr. Hinshaw has been involved, that
Hmm.
many people have heard about, the essence of that case is we're alleging that certain charter freedoms have been violated, including freedom of religion, freedom of association, and of life, liberty, and security of the person, which is Section 7 of the Charter. And the government, Dr. Hinshaw, under cross-examination, she admitted that her orders, her health orders, violated those freedoms. But she justified them by saying that they were necessary in order to preserve the healthcare system and to save people from, the dreadful threat of COVID-19. And so the essence of the case is not going to be whether or not these things violate our rights, but whether or not the courts are going to say that the government was justified in violating them. And so really the essence of the case is um, can this be proven? Can it
Hmm.
be, can this balance that Dr. Hinshaw claims the government was engaged in, is it provable? Is it actually supported by evidence? We say no, and they say yes, based upon modeling.
By modeling.
Modeling, yes. So this is kind of how it works. So, and I'm boiling this down somewhat. The basic gist of what the case is about, right?
Exactly. And the cross-examination just happened a couple weeks ago. So
Yeah,
it's fresh. So I do have to say Sheila Gunry did a great job of
she
tweeting
did.
it. And I was
Yeah,
following it along, thankfully, because
yeah.
it gave a really great insight into where you were going.
First of all, I should mention that I was working on the case with a wonderful lawyer named Jeff Rath, but Jeff and I are I think a very effective team because our styles are very different, and so we divided up the job, and so my style is very methodical. Uh, with someone like Dr. Hinshaw, I was playing chess. I'm trying to think 3 moves ahead, trying to control the narrative and kind of box her in and get her into a situation where she's repeating the same answers over and over again, where she's not really answering the question, where the question, and therefore the question sort of rises like cream above the milk of what she is saying. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, because
And
it's showing that she doesn't want to answer the question,
right,
but your point is being
right.
taken. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in our parlance, we call that controlling the narrative. Okay. And when you're dealing with somebody like Dr. Hinshaw, who obviously she's a very smart lady, she's very well educated, but at this point, actually, she's more of a politician than a physician. And so she knows how to answer questions, she knows how to deflect, and she basically expects people to believe and trust what she's saying because she has this weight of authority, right?
Right.
And so she tends to talk down to people, and she tried to do that with me for a while, and then she figured out that that wasn't going to be effective. I caught her a few times, and then she started to realize, oh, maybe this big dumb oaf is not as stupid as he looks. And
Maybe
then
he's
she
not the
started,
hockey player. So
yeah,
how
she started to
how
be more careful. She
so
started to be
when
more
did you
careful.
notice there was a shift in how she was communicating with you?
I
And
would
what was the
say,
point?
yeah, I would say about halfway through, because I cross-examined her for about 3 days. I did the bulk of it.
Mhm.
Jeff Rath's questioning of her, if you were going to ratio it, I was probably 80-20. I probably did 80%. He did about 20. And that was by design because I was laying the foundation for Jeff to come in there and really, I mean, Jeff is kind of a bull in a china shop. He comes right at you, you know, and he's puts a lot of pressure, and that's his style, and he's very effective that way. Whereas, as I said, I was sort of laying groundwork. Um, but I would say about halfway through the first day, the complexion of it changed, and she became more defensive. There was a bit of a war of wills where she was trying to make me understand that she was in charge,
Hmm.
and because she's used to being in charge. But unfortunately, no matter how smart you are, no matter how well educated you are, or who you are, it could be the prime minister or the president or the queen. The the game is a rigged game, uh, and when you're the lawyer and you are asking the questions, if you know your job and you're prepared and you know what you're doing and you have a plan and you stick to it, you control that narrative. And to the extent that somebody tries to fight you on that, it's like quicksand. And she started to realize, I think about halfway through the first day, that what she was doing wasn't working, and it was like quicksand and she was sinking. And then she tried to take a different tack. What she didn't realize is that I had anticipated that. I anticipated that she was going to do that, and then I fall, because this is what you do. You spend hours and hours and hours figuring, okay, if she goes this way, this is the way I'm going. If she goes that way, I'm going to go that way. And if you're prepared enough, you can think organically, just like you would in a chess match, right? If
Right.
your opponent makes a move, you have to think not only what the next move is going to be, but 3 moves ahead, because you're thinking about checkmate. But the essence of it is this, and factually, this is what people need to understand. There really isn't any credible science to support Alberta's position. In fact, their expert on virology is not even from Alberta. He's a professor from Manitoba. They brought him in for the case. So there was nobody really advising Dr. Hinshaw during the pandemic about virology.
You're
Okay.
saying they
They
didn't have a team of doctors that
no,
worked.
no. They back end. They only built up their case in response to the litigation. And this we know, and we can prove it. And here's why. We provided the government with all of our science, our case, in December of 2020. Okay. By that time, by December of 2020, the province of Alberta had been locked down for most of 9 months. Okay. Months
Mhm.
of pandemic. When we asked them for their science, to produce their science, they couldn't. They asked the court for an adjournment until the beginning of July to produce their science. Okay. Because they didn't have it. And so then in July,
My mind's blown right now
yeah.
because,
Oh
you're
yeah.
sitting here going through 2 years and you're having conversations with people. For me, I was having conversations like something doesn't seem right. There's some confusion, and then you're getting back the trust the science. The doctors have a big
Yeah.
team. Of
The
course, they have a
science.
big team. The science,
Yeah.
yeah. And now you're telling me that provincially, at least in Alberta, there was no team. It was just one person walking through
And it's
this.
true of the federal
Wow.
government too. It's Dr. Tam, and there really isn't credible science. There's really is no credible science to support the idea that these lockdown measures work.
Is this a push from a political agenda?
The short answer is yes. And I mean
Wow.
that's my view, but here's what I'll offer in support of it. Okay, so the when the government of Alberta finally produced their science, they produced a report from a Manitoba virologist. Okay, not someone from Alberta, and he was picked because he had testified in a Manitoba case in 2021. Um, and basically, the government's position is based upon modeling of what they said could have happened if they had not locked us down. So, what the government of Alberta is saying to us is that that they saved us from COVID. They saved the healthcare system through lockdowns. And what they do is they produce these graphs and these models, which they say show that when cases went up and they instituted lockdown measures, it worked and the cases went down. But that it happens to be rubbish. And I actually put this to Dr. Hinshaw under cross-examination. That actually what they did is they actually followed the cycle of the virus. So your life and my life and everything on Earth moves and grows in cycles. We know this naturally. Okay, this is plants, animals, everything grows in cycles, and our lives are like this, right? We have good days, we have bad days. This is what, and COVID-19 is no different.
Mhm.
So it goes through a cycle. And what happened, what the government of Alberta did very simply is this: they tested heavily. And when the cases, when they started to see the cases go up, okay, they would ease off restrictions, okay, and the cases would go up, And then they'd come out and they say, well, infection rates are up. And then what would happen is when the cycle of the virus would peak and start to go down, it was when the infection rate started to go down that they would impose restrictions. And so what they were doing is they were timing restrictions with the cycle of the virus. And so the virus was going down in its cycle. And then what happens is the government of Alberta comes out and says, see, we imposed restrictions and it worked. Magically, we kept the virus down. Of course, we know, and I put this to Dr. Hinshaw, we know that this is nonsense because right now in Alberta, we've never had more COVID and we have no restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
And we know, well, we do have some, we don't have very many, but we know the reason why we know lockdown restrictions don't work is because we still have COVID, right?
Absolutely.
This is what we know.
Mm-hmm.
And incidentally, Johns Hopkins University, their medical school, is one of the most renowned research hospitals in the world. In January of this year, they produced what's called a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is where scientists take many studies and they combine them and they compare data because they want to get a broad picture of what a certain question is. And so in this particular study, they were examining what the impact of lockdown measures were on reduction of deaths from COVID. And so this study compared 34 of the top studies over the past 2 years and found that the total reduction of deaths from lockdown restrictions was at best, on a best case scenario, 0.2%. 0.2%.
You
Okay.
can't really argue with that. Yeah.
Well, but the government of Alberta did, and they
Right.
fought like crazy to keep that study out of evidence, and they succeeded.
You're kidding. So on what grounds? How do you work something out of evidence? Like what did they
Well,
say?
they were able to keep it out of evidence because the study didn't come out until January of this year. And so the government argued that that study was irrelevant because Dr. Hinshaw and company would not have had that study at the relevant time when they were imposing all the restrictions. Of course, that belies the fact that all of these studies, these 34 studies that are included in the meta-analysis, would have been available to the government of Alberta if they had looked. And by the way, there was also a study from the Fraser Institute, which is a very renowned think tank from an economist that was released in April of 2021, which said precisely the same thing. In fact, I put this study to Dr. Hinshaw under cross-examination, and that particular study formed the opinion that lockdown measures were perhaps the worst policy ever, worst public policy ever in the history of Canada. So there's ample evidence, in our view, that these restrictions don't work. But the government's whole case, the way they're justifying this, is they're saying that these measures worked and that they saved the healthcare system and that they saved lives based upon this graphing that I described.
Mm-hmm.
But you see, what I put to Dr. Hinshaw is that although we can see empirically, scientifically, that cases went up and cases went down, that part is true. That's objective. But the interpretation of the government of Alberta that's putting on that as to the reasons why it went up and down, that's totally subjective. And we say, fabricated in order to justify a conclusion. There's a couple other important facts that came out during the trial, and I received many, many hundreds of emails. And if anyone listening were the people who sent emails of support, I'm grateful for that.
You were getting a lot of emails?
Oh yeah,
Like
hundreds a day. Hundreds a day.
hundreds a
Oh yeah.
day.
There was one person who told me I was going straight to hell. And well, you can't.
Wow.
What did Abraham Lincoln say? You can't please everybody all the time, or
No.
something like to that effect. But the thing is, people in those emails were shocked by some of the things that were coming out. For example, I put to Dr. Hinshaw that before Omicron, the highest infection rate in Alberta at any time throughout the first and second, third waves when we were all locked down was 13%. So that means that 87% at the height of lockdowns, 87% of the people in Alberta were not even infected with COVID. Now remember, of that 13%, only about 4% of that total are at risk of serious health outcomes such as hospitalization, ICU, or death. And so the way that shakes down is about 96% of people have no risk of those outcomes, and about 4% are at risk. And they're almost all over the age of 70 and have multiple comorbidities. But people were shocked to learn that, the average rate of infection at any given time was between 3 and 5%. Okay, because all we heard about in the media was COVID, COVID, COVID. Everything's COVID. COVID's in my water. It's in my coffee. It's in my toilet bowl. How do I get away from it? I have to wear a mask when I'm, alone,
Hmm.
and while I'm sleeping, while I'm jogging. By the way, another one was I put it to Dr. Hinshaw. I said there is no authoritative study showing that there's any risk of people getting COVID outside, which is true. There's no study anywhere that says people can get COVID outside.
And what did she
And
say when you brought points like that up?
she acknowledged that, but she said we had to be on the safe side. So that's why we restricted outdoor gatherings. They imprisoned, for example, Pastor Timothy Stevens for having
Yeah.
a church service outside, even though there was no risk, virtually no risk of anyone getting COVID outside.
What happens at this point? Okay, let's go one step at a time because I was following this closely and I got really confused.
Uh huh.
I got confused when the judge called a private meeting with Dr. Deena Hinshaw, and then I lost track of it. So, did I lose track of it, or is that where it ended?
Don't feel badly. It was a bit of an old fashioned cliffhanger,
It
and we're
felt like
still
that.
yeah,
Okay.
and we're still hanging. But
Okay.
but the crux of it is this: during the course of my cross examination of Dr. Hinshaw, first of all, people should understand, and maybe they don't, that these orders are really unprecedented in Alberta law. Okay, those of us who went to high school, we learned how law was made. First, second, third reading. And that's how our laws are made, through democracy. Well, during COVID, this all changed because the government really beefed up the Public Health Act, and they basically made Deena Hinshaw the most powerful person in the history of Alberta. They made her a dictator. And by the way, dictator is not necessarily a bad word. It has a bad connotation, but dictator comes from ancient Rome, and it means in ancient Rome, the Senate would appoint somebody who had some expertise and they would be given specific powers to solve a certain problem, and then they would report back to the Senate, and that person was called the dictator. Well, the Public Health Act creates a dictator, and the problem is Deena Hinshaw, and this is revealed in the trial, doesn't know a lot about anything except public health. And the problem is her orders deal with just about every aspect of our lives. But these orders are hers. They read, I, Deena Hinshaw, hereby order. Okay. And then it says all of the restrictions. Well, what came up in the trial, and this is getting at the answer to your question, is I should back up a step and note that Verna Yu, who is who's the CEO of Alberta Health Services, strangely was fired on the first day of the trial, which kind of follows a pattern. We've had very interesting things like this happen throughout when the trial was going on. But anyway, Verna Yu was fired on the first day, and she had sort of been Deena Hinshaw's right-hand person. She had done a lot of the dirty work. For example, ordering the closure of Grace Life Church. But the thing is, during my questioning of Dr. Hinshaw, whenever I put it to her that these were her orders, she would deflect that. And she would say, well, actually, I was just an advisor and I was giving advice to the premier and cabinet. And actually, these orders were really their orders, even though my name's on them. That was really, because I'm not an elected person. So she deflected this.
Mhm.
And of course, that's not what the law says. And so Jeff Rath picked this up and he put it to her, and he basically raised this issue of whether or not this was a proper, whether she properly exercised her powers. And so that what happened was the the government lawyers, they were ready to spring into action, and they're claiming something called cabinet privilege. Okay, cabinet privilege means that that a witness in a case like this would not have to answer questions about things that are discussed by the cabinet when they're having private discussions in camera. And the reason for this is because um, there's a principle of constitutional law that basically says, you know, politicians, cabinet ministers need to feel free to speak their mind on certain important issues, let's say COVID-19 restrictions, without fear that they're going to be subpoenaed and they'll have to testify about it in court. And so this has been recognized in law. But part of the argument that Mr. Rath was making was that, you know, actually Deena Hinshaw is not really a politician, and that the Alberta public has a right to know, for example, whether Deena Hinshaw went to the province, went to the premier and his cabinet, and recommended very, very stringent restrictions. And Mr. Kenney and his government said, "Well, no, we're not going to go. We're not going to go quite that hard.
Right.
We're going to have restrictions, but lighter ones, or vice
Mhm.
versa."
Mhm.
You know, whether Deena Hinshaw maybe went and didn't recommend certain restrictions, but the government of Alberta, for political reasons, went and brought in severe restrictions. An example of this would be, if you remember, the Bowden Rodeo, where there was this Bowden Rodeo,
Yes.
and the premier came out right after it and said, "Here come a lot of restrictions, right? We're going to put an end to this." Okay. And even though there wasn't a single case of COVID that arose from the
Not
Bowden
one.
Rodeo,
Right.
we got it around. We got this whistle stop injunction that made it basically illegal to publicly protest the Alberta government over COVID anywhere in the province. That applied to every man, woman, and child in the entire province. So what happened was there is a constitutional case in which this issue was resolved by the judge asking the witness certain questions in what's called in camera, in private, so only
Mhm.
she can hear the answers. And then she reports back. She provides a decision about whether or not the chief medical officer of health is required to answer questions about this, or whether she can rely on privilege. The Alberta government lawyers are claiming privilege, and they've also threatened that if the judge does not decide the case their way, they're going to appeal immediately. So what happened was we had this cliffhanger situation where the judge sort of left things off, and she said, "I'm going to have my decision in a week." It's more than a week now, and we're still waiting on that decision. So there could be more cross-examination, depending on whether or not the judge finds that Dr. Hinshaw has to answer these questions about what was said between Dr. Hinshaw and the premier and his cabinet, or that may be the end of questioning, and we'll simply submit written arguments. But
And
hopefully
you
that
won't.
explains why there was this sort
Yeah,
of cliffhanger situation.
it does. It just I don't know if anyone else is thinking that, but in the event that the information doesn't, you'll never know what was said behind closed doors.
No,
Is that
no.
wow.
And that's a great point.
Wow.
And one of the things that Mr. Rath and I really hope will happen, um, and what we think needs to happen, is we need to have a full public inquiry.
Mhm.
It's very interesting. Like, this case it's a civil case and has a very narrow focus. But what needs to happen is we need to have a public inquiry into the impact of lockdowns. And what a public inquiry would do is it would give Albertans the opportunity to come forward and provide anecdotal evidence of how they were impacted. If they had a family member who, lost their job, or if they lost their business, or, if someone, there was an opioid death or a suicide or something like that. Um, we really need to have a public inquiry into these things, so that our governments can be informed about whether or not these things actually work. And so, for example, we have public inquiries all the time. For example, we had a public inquiry into the impact of Indian residential schools. We had the Sinclair
Mhm.
Commission. We had all these recommendations. Well, Indian residential schools only affected a small fraction of Canadians, even generationally. Well, here we have restrictions that they impacted every single Albertan, even the unborn, even indirectly, the dead, when you think of restrictions on funerals.
Mhm.
So why don't we have a public inquiry into these things? I mean, it shouldn't be just two lawyers asking these questions. Um, every day, Albertans have the right to question their government, what their government is doing, and the public inquiry process, I think, is very important. And I hope that comes. I hope that is a direct result of this case by raising this awareness. Because remember, a lot of this stuff has been censored, and much of my cross-examination of Dr. Hinshaw surrounded the government's censure of scientific information and the way that it was fed to the public through the media and also through Dr. Hinshaw's own um, press conferences. And on this point, actually, one of the things about public inquiries, one of the things that Jeff Rath and I did is Jeff Rath asked Dr. Hinshaw about suicides. And she said she couldn't speak to that we would have to ask the chief medical officer of health. And so we did. We drafted a letter and we sent it to the chief medical officer of health mid-trial and said, Dr. Hinshaw testified that we have to ask you about the incidence of suicides during lockdowns. And so we urge you to commission a public inquiry into the connection between lockdown measures and the incidence of suicides and opioid deaths in Alberta. So, this is an example of, we're trying to use this particular case to
Yes.
raise public awareness, because I really see this case and lockdown measures as as a form of public abuse, really,
Mhm.
by governments
Mhm.
of Canadians. And when I interviewed Theron Fleury recently, he talked about this, and he said that one of the things that was so triggering for him is because he was a victim of historical sexual abuse. He saw our government, the way our government was behaving, as being textbook abuser behavior.
Wow, that's incredible,
Yeah,
actually, when you use that as the analogy.
yeah, it's a very
That's
fascinating
incredible. Mhm.
analogy, and one that most people would not be alive to unless they would have unless they had the misfortune of being the victim of some form of sexual or other abuse.
I found, through the process of this whole 2 years, fascinating from a perspective of I had questions, and you couldn't even I guess that's the form of public opinion. You couldn't even bring questions up just to talk about it like we used to talk. We used to communicate with each other. Whether you agreed with someone or disagreed, you could walk away from not agreeing
Mhm.
from with that person and just do your own thing, right? But in this case, while this was going down, if you even questioned numbers or what was being said or, this doesn't quite make sense. The public opinion, and it happened to me a lot. I would get some major pushback. You have been investigating this for the last year and a half.
Mhm.
What were you seeing in the public opinion part of this?
Well, I think that's a great question, um, and I'm going to refer to another book. Sorry, it's called
Now this is 4. Do you get
yeah.
this?
There's a great there's a guy that most people have heard of. His name is Ben Shapiro.
Yes.
He's involved with the Daily Wire in the United States, and he's a Harvard trained lawyer. He doesn't practice as a lawyer, but he's trained as a lawyer. But he wrote one recently, a couple years ago, called "The Right Side of History," and it's a fascinating book because what he says is that Western culture is really the exception in the world, and that it's the result of two streams of thought. One is Judeo-Christian morality, and the other is the sort of reason, the rational logic thought that we get through the ancient Greeks and then through the European, Enlightenment political philosophers, the people who framed the constitutions of, for example, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And he says these two streams of thought really produced um, Western, the Western culture. And at the core of that culture is exactly what you're talking about. It's this conversation across time where people have the freedom to express themselves with the idea that even bad ideas deserve to be aired because we don't know if they're good or if they're bad. For example, there was a time when the consensus of opinion was that, in fact, the, the the sun rotated around the Earth and that the Earth was flat. Well, over time, through this conversation across time, strongest steel is forged in hottest fire. We have these conversations. We have these conversations across time, and what happens is this exchange produces the truth. And you see this happen in science. You see it happen in politics. You see it happen in literature. You even see it happen in the technological world, right? Where different forms of technology come together. But what's happening in our society now is we're having this censorship of one side of the debate, and the reason why is I think the dominant ideas, the ones that are being pushed right now, are bad, and because they're bad ideas, they don't hold up to scrutiny, right? When you hold them up to the light, they look flimsy, and so you can't have a debate. We can't even have a debate about, for example, whether Donald Trump should be kicked off of Twitter, right? And censorship has become normalized to the point where
Hmm.
our prime minister right now and his government has a law that's about to come into effect where they're going to control everything that's said on the internet. They're going to determine what's appropriate and what's not. And look at the Freedom Convoy, right? And look at what the prime minister said.
Yeah.
These Freedom Convoy, their ideas they have inappropriate ideas, right? They're a fringe minority with inappropriate ideas. Well, you know what? The fringe minority historically has changed the world, right? It's
Right.
always a fringe minority. Take suffrage, the vote for women. Well, it wasn't millions of women who rose up and said, "Hey, we should all have the vote." It was actually a very small group, a very smart, very dedicated, very brave women who lobbied and fought that fight, and they opened up the doors for all women.
Hmm.
And this is what it's been throughout history. But for example, let's take women in suffrage. What if we lived in a society where women were not even allowed to speak the idea that they should have the same vote as men, right? Imagine that. What would that mean? What kind of society will we
Hmm.
have today? And you know what? There are many societies throughout the world where women are not on an equal footing with men. And that is why many people from around the world want to come to Canada, right? Because men and women here are treated equally under the law, and they do have the right to express themselves. So it's a very important question, and we're going through a crucial time right now where we have to decide whether these cultural values that we've held dear for centuries, going all the way back, and which have really sustained us, whether these are worth preserving. And people like me who are conservatives, that's precisely what we're trying to conserve. I'll mention another book. Sorry, Dr. Roger Scruton, has written
Five.
many books. He
Yes.
passed away a few years ago, but he was a brilliant man. But he wrote one book called "What How to Be a Conservative," and in that he defined what a conservative is by asking the question, "What does a conservative do?" Well, a conservative conserves. Well, what does a conservative conserve? He says beauty. And he defined beauty as all the things that fathers and mothers hand down to their children, right?
Wow.
It's the great inheritance of all the things that have come before. So in there is art, literature, music, family history, family traditions, Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, uh, you know, a liberal arts education, health, all the things that we value, that we hold dear, that we think are beautiful, art, even architecture, all those things that we hold dear that need to be conserved in order for our civilization to be preserved. And the people who are trying to destroy free speech, who are trying to destroy freedom, they're trying to destroy that tradition. They want to erase it, and they want to replace it with something else. The problem is there isn't anything else. And if there is something else, it isn't very good. I mean, just look at literature. I mean, there
Hmm.
isn't anything, it doesn't get better than Shakespeare. I'm not saying that the West is better in every way, but there's a reason why millions of people are trying to get here, and I think it's incumbent on us, who are the inheritors of the Western tradition, to preserve it because it's important. It's really important.
Let's take one more comparison, something that I was specifically dealing with when I talked to people about this. If you think freedom is being challenged in Canada, look at China.
Oh
And
boy.
I don't know if you have had that conversation, but I can tell you it happened more than once to me. And they were people around my age, intelligent uh, individuals. And I'm like, why are you comparing Canada to China? Well, how can you even compare the two? But the fact that's even in your realm of, if you think you've got it bad, look at China. No thanks.
Yeah. No, that's very true. But unfortunately, um, Canada is adopting many of the practices of the Chinese government. This is true. This is measurable. Um,
Like
it's
what?
quite true. Well, for example, disrespect for human rights. Okay. Um, the concentration of political power in a central government. And remember, this goes directly against the way that Canada is set up.
Hmm.
The people who founded Canada were very smart people. Even though people want to push over their statues now, there wouldn't be a Canada without Sir John A. Macdonald and people like
It's
that.
true.
It just would
Hmm.
not be here, folks. I'm sorry. Uh, and what they did is they realized that Canada was a huge country with the second largest landmass in the world. It's a huge country, and so the federal system is set up so that the provinces can take care of uh, things that are of local government concern. And so Canada as a country, because we're so big, um, the way that people live in Alberta is very different than the way people live in Newfoundland or Nova Scotia or even Quebec, right? And so we have this diversity. And so it's very important that local governments have the ability to solve local problems. But what's happened under Pierre Trudeau and now Justin Trudeau is we've had this concentration, this vacuuming of power to a central government actually in one office. This is horrifying, but the prime minister's office actually has over 1,500 employees now. Okay, 1,500 employees just working in the prime minister's office, and so we have this centralization of power
Is
in a
that different
government.
than normal? And you'll have to excuse me for
It
not knowing
was
that.
it was a tenth that size uh, when Justin Trudeau's father was prime
Wow.
minister. Okay,
Okay.
so that gives an example of the amount of number of people
Hmm.
and the concentration of power in in a central government. And Canada does not function very well under those circumstances. Canada tends to function better when we have strong regional governments, because we're such a big country. Both federal and provincial governments are talking about digital identification. Well, this is something that China has pioneered. And in fact, I don't know if your listeners have heard about this, but there's talk of Canada bringing in a digital currency that would be programmable. And this is what that would look like. Instead of John or Jane Doe getting their paycheck and being able to spend their money on whatever they want, what they will get is they will get this digital currency that's programmable, and there will be restrictions upon how they can spend their money, and how, for example, if somebody wanted to support your podcast, okay, they want to spend their money to subscribe to your podcast. If that was considered unacceptable or inappropriate by the government, they couldn't do that.
Yeah.
They couldn't donate to the causes that they want to donate to. So that's an example of how Western governments are adopting this Chinese approach. And of course, it's important to remember that the lockdown restrictions that all of us experience have been pioneered in China. And you're
Hmm.
quite right. We're watching right now these just incredibly horrifying scenes from Shanghai of people being rounded up like animals. And for that matter, animals being just summarily slaughtered in the streets, dogs and cats being electrocuted. It's like it's like a strange Quentin Tarantino movie, really. But what's happening, unfortunately, is China has an agenda to demoralize the West because
Right.
they are intent upon world domination. They're essentially 21st century Nazis, and they are propaganda. They're propagandizing our media, and they've have infected Western culture with. I'm going to mention another book. Gad Saad wrote a book called "The Parasitic Mind," where he talks about this. He's a evolutionary psychologist at McGill, and he wrote a book about how this is being done, how our culture has been infected by these parasitic ideas that destroy us from the inside. The Soviets called this demoralization. How they would destroy, they would, and these ideas are in our universities, they're in our media, they're in our schools, they're in our churches, they're everywhere, and it's manifesting itself in ways that Canadians are finding we are far less free and far less tolerant, and frankly far less happy
Hmm.
than we used to be. It's important to note, anyone who's unvaccinated in Canada has the distinction of living in the only country in the world where if you're not vaccinated, you cannot get on a plane, a train, or a ship. Notwithstanding the fact that we live in the second largest country in the world, you can't get on a plane or
Wow.
train. There's no other country in the world where that's true. So that gives you an idea of how Canada used to be the admiration, used to have the admiration of the entire world, and now on a recent survey that rates countries in terms of how free they are, Canada is languishing in 163rd place, neck and neck with Mali, um, Lebanon, and Ukraine.
You're kidding.
Yeah, Ukraine, which is of course under martial law.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
so that's where Canada is on the freedom scale right now.
Which doesn't it, of course, that's not surprising me. So, do you see accountability? Do you see an accountability coming to the people who, well, you're cross-examining Dr. Deena Hinshaw, the government, the people that are putting the lockdowns, the restrictions, and have put it in place? Do you see any accountability coming, like personal responsibility?
Yes, well, I think they're going to be scapegoats,
Okay.
and I think that the chief medical officers of health are going to be casualties. Some of them already have been. Some of them have had to resign. I think you're going to see people like Dr. Hinshaw and Dr. Henry in BC are going to be fired. I think Dr. Tam, her days as the chief uh, medical officer for Canada are numbered. Same thing with Dr. Fauci. I think these people are convenient. Well, Lenin called them useful idiots. They're convenient fall guys for political leaders. But the thing that's going to have to change, and I was listening to a podcast involving Preston Manning, who is a person I really admire. He's one of the founders of the Reform Party. He's 80 years old now, but he's still sharp as a tack. And he was saying one of the things that's really changed in Canada from the time when he started in politics. And remember, his father was the longest serving premier in the history of
Mhm.
Alberta. He said that what's happened is Canadians, especially young people, are not getting involved in the grassroots level of politics. They're not getting out into to serve on school boards. And I was talking about these God love them these ladies in the United States who are getting involved in challenging what's going on at the school board trustee level. We need much more of that in Canada. And what bothers me is, for example, right now everybody's all excited because Elon Musk is going to buy Twitter
Right.
and he's going to be the messiah of free speech. Well, no, that's never going to work. This guy is the richest man in the world, and I hate to break it to you, he doesn't care about you, and he may not care very much about free speech.
No.
Okay, anybody that rich cares a lot about making money and being famous and being in the public eye, and that's great. That's Elon Musk. Power to him. But the thing is, if we want to change if we want to, getting back to my definition of a conservative, if we want to conserve what's valuable, every one of us has to get out into the communities, reach out in the communities, reconnect, and get out in the communities and talk to people, get involved with, Cub Scouts and local sports and dance troops. And when somebody comes around for a political rally, get out there and listen to them
Yes.
and form your own opinions. Don't accept what the mass media says, and listen to podcasts like this one, where you can discover different ways of looking at things. I still have a lot of faith in Canada. I think it's a great country full of wonderful people.
Mhm.
And I think the best days for our country are in front of us. I'm going to mention one more book. Sorry. Conrad Black
Oh,
wrote a
wow.
book called The Canadian Manifesto a few years
Mhm.
ago.
Mhm.
I encourage people to read it because it presents a very positive picture. He thinks, and I agree with him, that Canada's best days are ahead of us, that we're on the cusp of becoming a world superpower. And he says that because Canada is approaching 50 million population, and historically that has been a threshold where nations really soar into the heights of being in like the G7 and being world leaders. And Canada is approaching that metric. But he says it's going to take some changes, and that is we're going to have more policies, economic policies, political policies, and cultural policies that are focused on Canada and not globalism. Globalism destroys countries like Canada. We have to get away from globalism. We have to get back to focusing on Canadians and what's best for us in our country. And that doesn't mean we don't welcome people from around the world, because we've always done that, and that's part of
Mhm.
the reason why Canada is a wonderful country. But what Conrad Black thinks is that if we get the right leadership, and if we all take ownership of our own country and we invest in it, that Canada's best days are ahead of us. And I believe that's true. I don't think Canada's done. I think that we do have some very malevolent people in politics and in power who have a plan for Canada that involves its destruction. But I don't think they're going to win, because I just think there are too many good people in this country. I talk to them every day. I serve them as their lawyer. I get to talk to them on my podcast. I get to talk to them on other people's podcasts. And I think I have a great sense of gratitude about being Canadian, and I don't think that's unique by any stretch.
The amount of guests that you've had on are intellectually stimulating, and the conversation you're going to throw in a couple books I noticed as well. So keep
Yeah,
keep
I think
piling
it's
them
good
up.
for people to read.
It is great. I'm just
Yeah.
bugging you, but now I have 6.
Okay.
So so the podcast is Gray Matter, and thank you again for joining me. I'm looking forward to hearing how this court case goes.
Thank you, Heather. It's been my pleasure.